Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are around the world. A very, very warm welcome. Delightful to have you here for this conversation and to be able to take part in this session, Lessons from 2020, Views from the Aftershock Dialogues Network. Let me just quickly review the session description just to make sure you're all in the right meeting. That's the first thing you need to do at the beginning of a conversation. The COVID-19 crisis has produced a new impetus to innovation practice around the world, from do teams to learning communities, heightening its sense of purpose. And this is one of the wrap-up reflections from the Aftershock Dialogues. I'll talk about that in a minute. We have some leading thinkers and practitioners in the innovation space to share their insights on the crisis and what it reveals about the evolving nature of public sector innovation and what government can expect now and into the future. How can we push the boundaries of the conventional to spur lasting transformation? So I reckon we should be able to fix that up in about an hour and a quarter. Probably a day and a quarter might be good, but it's going to be an intense and lively conversation, and we're just absolutely thrilled that everybody can come and join us, as I say, from wherever you are around the world. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the session in just a moment and run you through roughly what we're going to do, and I'm going to introduce you more formally to our esteemed panel and our guests. But look, before I do, I'm going to jump straight in and invite you to do some work, actually. I know that's a bit of a rude shock when you've just tuned in as you settle back and get ready to hear and engage. But I actually want you to do some work, if you wouldn't mind, or at least I'll invite you to. On the event app, you will find a poll column where you can go in and answer this particular poll question. And let me put it to you, and then you can, while I'm reading it out, you can go and find that out. And answer it. Question: has the COVID-19 pandemic and associated crisis made public sector innovation something to be expected instead of questioned? So hop into the poll, hop into the column, and while you're all busy doing that in the background, I'm just going to run through a few context setting pieces, and I'm going to introduce our panel. And hopefully by the time we get round to their first observations, we'll get some responses from you, and we'll see where you've come out on that particular question. Something to be expected instead of questioned. Now, during the session, we absolutely encourage everyone to get involved in the chat. I think people are probably pretty familiar by this stage of the process about how we work on these virtual platforms. And you can ask and upvote questions. And there is a hashtag, of course, you would expect, hashtag #GovAfterShock, all one word. So please hop into the conversation at any level. We'll keep a track of what's happening on all the various sidebar discussions and so on. So please get involved. There have been over 60 events associated with government aftershock from the OECD. It's amazing. I've just been reviewing some of them again over the last couple of days. And in fact, I've been to a couple just very recently here in Australia. And they've been run by different groups around the world in the lead up to today. And they've all been united by these questions about what it is we're going to leave behind and what it is we need to keep from this astonishing process period that we've just been. This session is going to focus on some learning from the broader ecosystem about what folks around this conversation have seen in the public sector and what they think that might imply for the future. I'm going to put my quick tuppence worth in here and make two quick observations. One is a quote, actually, I'm going to share, and the other is an observation which I checked in the last 24 hours. Apparently, November the 17th, 2019, which for most of us anyway, is a year and a day from where we are now, was the first reported case of coronavirus in China. I think we've only found that out relatively recently. So the anniversary is an interesting one. As they say, never mind what a difference a day makes, what a difference a year makes. And the question that we're going to explore a bit this evening is, what difference has it made? What are the things we want to hang on to? And what are the things, frankly, we might not want to hang on to as a result of what we've been experiencing over the last 12 months? What that's going to do as part of this conversation is contribute to the development of a call to action for governments around the world, and indeed for the OECD itself. And I'm hoping that all of our panelists, and indeed many of you on the call, will have some ideas to throw at the organisation who are very kindly hosting us. The institution itself, I'm sure the OECD has got plenty of things to think about as to how it evolves and how it adapts. So I'm delighted to be joined by this wonderful panel, and I'm going to invite them very shortly to say a few words just to set the scene. Nadine Smith, who's a director for the Centre for Public Impact, who's joining us, I think, from London in the UK. Brenton Caffin, who's the Executive Director of States of Change, who's joining us from Adelaide in South Australia, recently also from Nesta, so not all that long ago in the UK. Matthew Taylor, many people I think on this call will know as the CEO of the RSA in the UK and a former very senior policy advisor in number 10 Downing Street. I seem to recall there's been a bit of interesting movement in and out of policy advisor positions in number 10 this week. Who knows, we might even get to talk a little bit about that later. And Giulio Quaggiotto, who is the Regional Innovation Coordinator for the UNDP based in Bangkok. So we have a panel suitably and appropriately spread across the globe, and absolutely delighted to have them on board as well. I'm just going to double check and see how we are going with our, here we go. Let me just give you a quick, this is actually partly for our panelists, so you might want to make a quick note of this. So the answers to that question, is it something now to be expected rather than questioned, is only, well, not only, 50% said yes, 11% said no, and 38.9%, and I'm going to be really, really smart and round that up to 40%, said too early to tell. 40%. There's an interesting observation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start with Nadine. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to spend 2 or 3 minutes reflecting. If you want, you can reflect on that answer, which is kind of interesting in itself. But what is it you've reflected on as you think back now over this 12 months? If you've come up with one really big insight that you think really sums up the year, that might be a big ask at the beginning of the conversation. But where would you take us if you were trying to just give us a sense of the reflections that you come for the last 12 months? So Nadine, over to you for a minute.
Thank you, Martin. And hello, everybody. And thank you to the OECD for hosting this event. So there are many things that we're still learning about ourselves and our communities and, of course, our countries through this pandemic. But the overall biggest learning for us at the Centre for Public Impact, and many of those who we have been speaking to over the past several months, is that we really haven't learned yet how to listen. And I mean how to really deeply, or some people say radically, listen. And many believe if we had learned that, we wouldn't be struggling as much as we are today on a number of fronts. Much of the decision making we've seen has been based on an outdated idea that governments know what to do, that they will announce it, and that people will follow. But that notion of government knowing all the answers has always been a fallacy, and that is unraveling right before our eyes now. And on top of that is the problem that we don't have the mechanisms to listen well either. We've realized and learned that participative democracy is still very immature. The spaces that we have to collaborate and discuss are limited, and therefore power can be assumed by a few people very quickly. For many, that's been quite a shock. Through the pandemic, we learned a whole set of assumptions were being made about how people live that were wrong and even did damage, from the way people have been spoken about, not spoken about at all, to the lack of understanding about the impact on our care homes, our loved ones, schools, and people's jobs. Now, our systems lack empathy and compassion, and we now have learned are not optimized for learning. Such things have been seen as traditionally second-order characteristics of effective governments. Yet in the United States, we heard in our conversation, our event yesterday, that governments are asking people to trust a system that has historically treated people unequally and let people down. But when listening is done well, trust can grow, relationships can flourish, and good things can emerge, even from the darkest of circumstances. So this is not a one-size-fits-all prescription for listening. We've heard from people there isn't one. People have learned to do it in their own way, but it will be worth it if we can do this learning, because we can learn an awful lot when we listen about how we should respond to COVID and help people to contribute to future ideas and support others to do the same. We need to enable listening to happen in whatever form it takes, in order to build collaboration. So it becomes part of our DNA and our culture, not something we do on the side or anything we call an innovation anymore. And through radical listening, some communities have created spaces to be heard. And through that, faster, better feedback loops, even in a pandemic, even with centralized government. And indeed, some people who never believed they would have broken through barriers and have finally got to the table in government. I don't know if you call that innovative, but more how it should be. But many worry, of course, that we'll just go back to normal and we'll make listening more for control and extraction, not for learning and action. And in our UK event yesterday, we heard from 6 organisations who were experimenting with new ways of listening, from storytelling to appreciative inquiry approaches. Everyone agreed listening must be for learning, not for blame. We should never again make any decision about people without people again. And through listening, we can definitely see the hope in changing the face of power and building connections and discovering ideas and energy in our communities we didn't know existed. Our own community listening at the Centre for Public Impact revealed that people do want to help, people can be heard, they are experts in their own lives and they know exactly what they need to do, but they just don't feel enabled to do it. And the same messages come through to us from frontline staff as well. Now, listening is not a panacea for all our world problems, of course, but it offers us a different way of thinking about the recovery and rebuild. It goes beyond building things to doing more things to just being more human. And this is about sharing power, government. It's not about giving it up. Please don't fear, but it is about thinking about power differently. The new role of government, I suggest, is to enable places of listening, learning, and collaboration to grow. Government can encourage it, see those good ideas emerge, so people feel they really own and are jointly responsible for the actions too. And that would be a more responsible way, a more realistic way of thinking about accountability for these very complex times when no one person knows the answer anymore and should be accountable for it. I'll just end with 2 quotes we heard. They're very powerful yesterday. As one community leader said, you need to build the road ahead with the same people who kicked out the system. And another said, the people in power don't know us, so it's our job to bring them to a place of understanding. So for us, we see this as the time to learn to listen again, and do so for learning that will rebuild a nation. But let's never listen again for control. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a tidy little agenda, I must say. Radical listening, that's fantastic. So we've managed to hit some big buttons there: power, control, deep questioning of assumptions. I like the phrase too, which I think I once picked up in some early work I did in the disability sector. Nothing about us without us, I think, is the phrase, and many people on this call will probably be very familiar with that. Let's go to Bangkok and the UNDP and Giulio. How would you reflect on what has been clearly a pretty astonishing, well, a year and a day, at least 12 months? Giulio.
Indeed, fairly astonishing, and seeing it from an Asian perspective, quite an interesting vantage point. You know, I had an old boss who used to say, when you're in doubt, you always state the obvious. So let me state my obvious lesson from the pandemic, which is in a case of an emergency like this one, you work with what you have. And by that meaning that governments that were made previous investments in basic and fundamental infrastructure were actually had more options at their hands to actually improvise and innovate in the conditions of emergency. So the lesson is obvious, I guess, but what the implications are moving further is much more complicated. So just to give a few examples that are fairly obvious, but you know, much has been said about how many countries in Asia were able to respond, at least from the health side, more effectively, building on the protocols they built on SARS. But I think one of the stories that's still not being told enough is that, at least for the first wave, how some African countries have done remarkably well, and some of them building on the protocols and the processes that were built for Ebola. Kerala is another example of a state that did particularly well at the beginning in their response, and were building on the protocols that were built for another tropical disease that was done before. So again, in the conditions of emergency, these options are available that then public servants, governments at large can play with. Same thing with investments in infrastructure, be it, for example, on digital safety nets. So we've seen it that countries that rely on aid external to compensate for lack of safety nets are finding much more difficult than countries that had already some, at least basic infrastructure, that then they were able to stretch to their limits and push to the boundaries under a condition of a pandemic. So cases, anything from Colombia to Pakistan, etc. Also simply physical infrastructure, you know, India repurposing 100,000 railway cars to become ambulances, right? So you have these opportunities to repurpose and reuse things creatively under a condition of emergency. And obviously this goes back also to, I think, what Nadine was saying, trust, right? So in conditions where social capital and trust was high, you were able to unlock new opportunities for collaboration that would have not been possible before. So again, you know, cases like in Korea, where there's been some really interesting public-private partnerships built on a tradition of developing this type of trust between different sectors that don't necessarily talk to each other, or Vietnam being able to develop low-cost testing by generating collaboration between you know, research centers, state, and otherwise. So obviously, I'll conclude here, working with what you have also means working with pre-existing conditions. Just like the disease seems to affect pre-existing conditions, the same thing happens when in situation with low trust, where there is very poor basic infrastructure to work with, and then this actually exacerbates in many sense the issues that were there before, and this is also part of the dynamics that we've seen. Concluding just by saying that for me, the really interesting question, I guess this is where you're taking next us, Martin, in the conversation, is what does this actually mean moving forward? Does this actually mean that governments have learned the lesson that some fundamental prerequisites need to be there to allow for innovation in case of shocks or not? And I think the question of that is very, very much open, as our poll actually shows as well.
Yeah, indeed. And indeed, you're quite right. I mean, I think the focus of our conversation is going to be, you know, tough and brutal though it's been, this experience has created a dividend here, some kind of, you know, and well, the question is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to invest it or waste it? Let's go back to London, Matthew. Opening thoughts, opening remarks. How do you begin to sift and sort through this astonishing year, just to give us some early markers from your end?
Well, thanks, Martin. Look, I mean, I think there's some very specific things which maybe we can get into the conversation. This has, after all, been an unprecedented global experiment, and there will be a lot of learning to be taken from how countries have coped. And, you know, I think, you know, as Giulio just said, you know, one of the really interesting stories here is that in some ways the developing world has done better than the developed world. And I think that's going to shake some complacency in some very powerful ways around the so-called advanced public service and policy making systems of countries like the UK, for example. I think a second very specific lesson is going to be about the importance of functional redundancy, that if you have systems which are operating at 100% of capacity, you have no way of coping with a crisis which demands more of those systems. But obviously there's a big resource challenge there. What I want to say though is this, that if you look historically at why is it crisis leads to change, and I think broadly speaking, and obviously in my 3 minutes I can't justify this statement, but it's based on analysis. Broadly speaking, there are kind of three conditions which are likely to determine whether or not crisis leads to change. Because crisis doesn't always lead to change, and it doesn't always lead to good change. And those three conditions are, first of all, was there momentum for change, capacity for change before the crisis, because change doesn't come from nowhere. Secondly, does the crisis prefigure the future in important ways? So do you see glimpses of the future in the response to the crisis? And then thirdly, as you emerge from crisis, and I guess that's what today is about, do you have the ideas and the coalitions to grasp the opportunity when people's minds are open, policymakers are more open to thinking about doing things differently? Those are the three conditions. Was there capacity before? Do we glimpse the future during the crisis? And then do we take the opportunity at the end of the crisis? So I want to say that I think there were two big debates about public services, broadly defined, which existed before the crisis, which I think have been accelerated during the crisis and which now give us an opportunity to shift the debate. The first is really around policy making and the nature of policy making and the consistent problems with policy making. And, you know, this is something I normally talk about for half an hour. I've got to do it in 45 seconds. But basically, I would say that policy making, particularly national government policy making, suffers from two recurrent non-trivial problems. Firstly, it tends to be too scattergun in terms of trying to influence complex systems by pulling particular levers. And secondly, it's too path dependent. It takes a long time to get a mandate, and then systems aren't able to learn. They aren't agile. And I think we've seen a lot of that in this policy, in what's happened in the crisis, but we've also seen very different forms of policy making. We've seen policies made more quickly and enacted more quickly than we ever thought government was possible of doing. So I think that will accelerate a shift, a questioning of the way in which we do policy and we think about policy, towards what we at the RSA call as a mindset. We call for thinking like a system, acting like an entrepreneur. So that different policy mindset, think systemically, act entrepreneurially. I think we'll see that idea accelerated. And then secondly, and lastly, in terms of public services, look, new public management, the massive global failed experiment of new public management was kind of dead, but like Carrie at the end of the film Carrie, it still had the capacity to push its hands through the soil and grab our necks, even when we thought we were just inspecting its corpse. And that was partly because there wasn't an alternative. And I think what you're seeing in this, crisis is two different momentums. And I think the fascinating question is, how will those come together? And that will depend an awful lot on different countries. So on the one hand, there's a technocratic set of imperatives, which is we've seen a massive leveling up in terms of digital in public services, a growth in analytical skills, a recognition of the importance of targeting, an understanding of the importance of trying to have more preemptive kind of systems. So there's a big push towards a more technocratic kind of approach, because public services really didn't succeed very often. They didn't have those kinds of tools. But on the other hand, exactly as Nadine said, the other story is the story of the inadequacy of a relational model, of a transactional model of public services, and the importance of moving to a relational model of public services, which sees public services as the outcome of a collaboration between state, citizen, and community. And I think the really interesting question for us going forward is that those two imperatives, the technocratic imperative exemplified by big tech firms, and the kind of relational imperative, which is driven by notions like deliberative democracy, engagement, different ways of thinking about assets in communities. How do those two, are we able to combine those two to create a new model of public services? Or will we see countries choosing different routes? Or will we see these systems continually clashing? For me, that's the big question.
Great. Well, we're setting up a nice conversation as to whether, in fact, we can sense this movement actually being taken. I have a feeling that the image of the conversation will be new public management as Carrie bursting through the coffin to grab the world one more time by the throat. So we'll all put that one away, I think, for a little bit later. That's terrific. Brenton, what you might like to do, first of all, is introduce where you are, because I suspect not everyone in the world would necessarily have tracked quite what's been happening in Adelaide and South Australia in the last, several hours. Nice to see you anyway.
Thanks, Martin. It's been a very interesting day, I have to say. So 2 weeks ago, we had zero community transmission in Adelaide, and have pretty much had so for the last 4 months. And 2 weeks later, we've gone into a 6-day lockdown because a number of clusters have broken out, which is a pretty severe lockdown, albeit a short one, right down to the fact we can't even exercise outside of our yard. So that's interesting. So having sort of sat outside watching the rest of the world sort of deal with this crisis, and sort of, there but for the grace of God, go us. Well, now we're going there. So some of my reflections are probably sort of morphing as we speak. I mean, I guess I want to start maybe sort of just building on something that Matthew said, which is this is sort of one of the largest natural comparative public policy experiments that the world has seen probably in the last 90 years, and one in which the virus is the constant, and that is creating both opportunities and challenges. Not only have we got the public health crisis, we've got an economic crisis, a trade crisis, international movement crisis, all on top of underlying geopolitical issues and the need to still take drastic action on climate change. And there isn't a playbook for this. Some countries have done pandemic planning. Some of them, have dusted off those studies. Others put them in the bin and shut down their units. So in many parts of the world, policymakers are having to navigate, unnerving degrees of uncertainty and rapidly revalidate our knowledge and assumptions about what works. But at the same time, in many areas, our policy options have expanded. And there's been lots of written about the Overton window in various sort of articles, but policy choices that would have been deemed unacceptable, would have been heretical if we'd brought them up last year, have been broadly tolerated, if not welcomed, by large sections of the public, whether it's social distancing, free childcare, mobile apps, and the privacy concerns that go with that, universal basic income, furloughing, labour market subsidies. Few of these policy measures would have been imaginable last year, and yet here they are with us. And maybe to link it back to today in Adelaide, it was interesting, all of the vox pops on the evening radio, the afternoon radio, said, people were saying, look, it's a pain, but we need to do this. So I think actually the social contract, as it were, is quite fluid at the moment, and we are exercising and building new muscles that we really haven't necessarily, as citizens and the state, and the relationship between the two, that we haven't really sort of exercised before. So I guess in the interest of time, I might sort of pause there, but just to say what we're really interested in thinking about is how do we recognize, surface, name this new muscle memory, and how do we make sure that we can sort of represent that back to people to recognize what they are now capable of, so that it is ready to be deployed on all of these other crises that are yet to come, the most obvious being climate change, which we're going to have to turn our minds back to pretty sharply, if indeed we haven't already.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going to push and dig a little deeper, and I'm going to invite, I'd probably point my finger, as it were, virtually to a few, but basically we're sort of open slather. By the way, for that folks listening, please, questions, comments, I'll keep a bit of an eye on the chat. So every time you see me fiddling around, it doesn't mean that I don't know what I'm doing with my iPad. I do. I'm looking for chat and questions if there are any coming. Let me go back to the poll question. You might recall 40% of the people who answered that poll said it's too early to tell, basically. They don't know, actually, if innovation is going to be expected or resisted. And I want to ask each of you to reflect on, I guess, what comes across to me, which is a very powerful emerging new paradigm, to use that kind of language. Is you're all picking up bits of it. Radical listening, the stuff that Matthew talked about, Giulio's kind of reflections about where the Asian governments are taking, and so on, at different dimensions. And the kind of question I'm beginning to wonder, and I suspect some of our participants are, which is why they marked the first poll, don't know, is what gives us confidence that this isn't going to be another missed opportunity here? What is it about what we know about government and the public sector, and indeed the relationship between politics and citizens, that says, no, this time maybe we've got some inklings that this is an opportunity we're not going to waste. This is a dividend we are going to invest in, much the way I think that that Matthew suggested. So I'm kind of interested if each of you would just come back, in a sense, and give some sense to the folks listening what it is you sense in the discussions, the conversations you're having, that, if you like, if I can put it like this, what's going to help this new emergent notion? What's going to be in our favor, but frankly, what's going to get in the way, and what is likely perhaps to trip us up? I'm going to start, Giulio, with you, if I could. And this is just completely random, but I just wanted to start in Asia, just to get your kind of particular perspective. What is it about what we know about the actual reality of the way government and the public sector works that we think is, maybe this time around we're going to crack it, or maybe we've got some doubts? So let's kind of surface those, if we could, for a moment. Giulio.
Thank you, Martin. Well, obviously part of a challenge in this is that the narrative will be so different in different geographies, right? And again, in many parts of Asia, the feeling is still that governments overall have done reasonably well, right? Which I understand is quite different from other parts of the world. But to answer your question, I think what is going to be important, I think goes back to Matthew's point, is what is going to be the narrative of success and who defines it, right? is a narrative of success that we, kept the number of cases low, or is number of, a measure of success that we have actually societies that are more cohesive, where the most marginalized communities are not being excluded from even further from opportunities, and how that narrative is going to be shaped it goes back a little bit to this like dichotomy between a technocratic narrative, I guess, and one more which is more relational. So I think the real question for me is, as we reflect on this and the type of society narratives that come out in terms of who has been successful really, and what has determined that success, will also put a lot of pressure, or on the contrary, release the pressure on public sector to innovate. Because the general feeling is that, some of our technocratic solutions have worked reasonably well. Yes, we did a few things differently, but, overall it's not too bad. And success is defined purely in those terms, then I think you will get a certain type of feeling of going back to normal fairly quickly. From the other hand, there is this sense that, whether it is the deep listening or the new modalities of working across different parts of society didn't work, or we need to push very differently, then I think there's going to be pressure for the public sector to adapt. Let me just say, there are some really basic things which I think have been put into question, right? So I've talked quite a lot with governments in this region, where if you want to have a meeting with another ministry, you need to have at least 5 or 6 letters, right, to get this going.
Yeah.
And with Zoom and the crisis coming up, this clearly has shown how absurd that modality is. Now, that is a very simple, almost ridiculous indicator, right? But if we go back to letters in a few months' time, then we really, it's almost as a basic, litmus test of are we actually going back to normal business as usual, or are we really questioning the way we are actually operating?
Yeah, terrific. Let me jump back to Matthew for a minute. Matthew, if I was being a little bit tough as a distant but interested observer in the British political and bureaucratic scene, I'd probably be asking myself some pretty kind of tough questions about whether the system is ready for the kind of emergent paradigm you're talking about. I'm not saying it's not happening. I'm not saying people don't want that to happen. But if you look at the way things are being run right now, both politically and bureaucratically, you'd have to say, really? You're going to, are we right to be a little bit skeptical, or am I just being a little unfair? And the sense that the energy and momentum behind the movement that you sketched so powerfully in your 3.5 minutes is going to carry us there. Give me your reflections on that. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, look, Martin, at the risk of being trite, I make it my business never to predict anything. And I don't predict things partly because our powers of prediction are pretty poor. And secondly, because I think it's a disempowering project. The future is the future that we decide for it to be, rather than the future which we can somehow discover and then become victims to. So, what will determine what happens? I'll give you 3 kind of elements. Firstly, will be experimentation and innovation, because as I think Brenton said, and echoing I guess what I said as well, that we are more aware at the moment of each other in other countries. We are looking around, and probably the greatest innovation in the world right now is not in nations, it's in cities, and there's an awful lot of incredibly exciting and very different kind of things happening in cities, where I think cities is a much more a scale for innovation. So the first thing is, will be that we continue to see, and I'm pretty confident about this, a pretty fast scale of innovation in cities, and that this curiosity about how other people are doing things around the world continues, and that will accelerate learning. So that's the first thing. The second thing is politics, to be frank, which is that, on the progressive wing, and I'm on the progressive wing, can progressives put together an account of public services, or will they get hung up on the kind of splits between the kind of more incremental left that is concerned with how you make things work, and the more radical left that wants to kind of, I don't know, for example, put its energies into making sure, to excluding the private sector from having any role in public services or whatever. So, there's a political argument here about the coherence of the kind of progressive case for public service reform. And then the final thing I'd say is also, I do think that the private sector is really important in this, actually. The private sector was a big part of the disaster of new public management. They exploited that. They sold snake oil. They made a lot of money. and to very little effect overall. Now, I think the private sector as a whole, big corporations have become more socially conscious in the last few years. They've become more reputationally concerned in the last few years. They have grasped issues like climate change much better. I think there's an important piece of work to be done, working with the large management consultancies and others, to be encouraging them not to respond to government asking them to win contracts to provide solutions which they know won't work, but which will make them a fast buck. So, an intelligent, responsible private sector, political organization, experimentation, those I think would be amongst the success factors.
Yeah, great. And you've also started to answer one question actually that's just come in, which is what is your sense about why new public management failed and what's coming next? We'll just hold that thought because we'll have some time to come back. Nadine, I want to come back because I also want to weave in a question that just popped up on the chat. I think the notion of radical listening, and I like the idea between a couple of you, I think, that listening is allied to learning, right? Theoretically, if you want to learn, you have to listen. The observation was made in one of the questions that the problem still in government, things are very siloed. In fact, if anything, they used this phrase in the question, there's more shouting, frankly, than there is listening. And that's a bit of a tradition, right? You just get in there and you put your elbows out, different departments, different silos and all the rest of it. Yeah. What's going to get us across that? Yeah. Where are we going to start hitting that issue?
It's a really good question, but I have to say, if I was saying, if I had something to say to government, central government right now in the UK, it would be, well, it's happening anyway, with or without you. There are movements and actions, and we have people who are becoming activists who never thought they would be, who may be patiently waiting behind the scenes at the moment, but they're not going to go away. So government may want to continue to not listen, if you like, and maybe there is more shouting going on behind the scenes. Well, we've read that there's certainly a lot of shouting going on behind the scenes, but out there in the communities, they're showing how you actually can govern better. And I think that I don't know if we need government to make the decision about the paradigm shift. I think it's going to happen anyway. And maybe that's me being an optimist, but I think that what we are seeing is that that people are willing to experiment themselves. They are willing to try. They are we're going back to base core values of just being human. And people are connecting in ways that they never have before. And this is happening regardless of the fact that governments become more centralized and feels more distant from people. So I'm going to hold on to that. But I want to say something a bit more positive about central government. I do think I agree with Matthew that the government has begun to change its language around trying new things. It's beginning to say, we don't know all the answers. We do need to try this. And I think government's done well at resisting temptations to get into media arguments about whether something's a U-turn. If they decide something one day and the next day the evidence looks different, they've changed their minds. And for the media, who are still miles behind, by the way, I think they've got a lot of catching up to do. They're like U-turn on the front pages. I think the public are growing up and with government together on this and recognizing that we do need to learn and adapt together quickly, and that we're working in a complex situation. And I think that handling and understanding of how complex this is and how quickly we need to react together, I think is a maturity of government. So that's a positivity I'm going to hold on to. But there's just one more thing I want to say has happened during this time that no one's mentioned yet. And that is that Black Lives Matter happened not that long ago and is still happening. And that is another, we talk about climate change activism, that is another form of social justice that is ready and waiting to have its day. And I believe will still have its day. I think many of us never have had our eyes opened in ways we haven't before. I fear that it will disappear, but I think it won't. But let's not forget how that has opened our eyes, not just at injustice, but to the huge problems around poverty as well in this country. And I do think that if government was going to be smart, let's remember the importance of transparency. A smart government now will anticipate the questions and the calls for public inquiries that will come about decisions it has made, yes, contracts it has awarded, etc., etc. We're very patient as public, as members of the public, not seeing how decisions have been made day to day, and we've accepted that for now, but those calls will come for a public inquiry. A smart government will preempt that, will begin to start to think about its new transparency agenda, which is absolutely essential, not just for this pandemic, but for also future decisions around climate change and Black Lives Matter as well.
I think
there are big.
Martin, can I
yes, please, Matthew. Yes, please.
I mean, I think, look, I mean, Nadine makes so many powerful points, but in relation to the issue around Black Lives Matter, I think that's an example of what I was talking about before in terms of political coalitions. I think that Nadine's absolutely right that this has focused this has produced a much deeper focus on anti-racism, but also on equality more generally, and particularly amongst younger people, a determination to say change must happen. Don't give us fine words, don't give us targets, don't give us blah, blah. Change must happen. But I also think that, tackling social injustice in terms of generating different outcomes is a hard and complex task that requires deep public engagement and innovation and all of that. And I slightly worry that there's a kind of, an obsession with cultural politics could divert us from the hard work that we need to do into a kind of space where we're all talking to each other and trying to say the right things, and we get disconnected from the communities that we really want to try to help. So that's a classic example, I think, of where politics is really important. Coalition building is really important in this stage of opportunity. Yeah,
look, I was just going to say, and I'm going to come to Brenton in just a sec. We've got these three big blocks, right? We've got government and the public service and the public sector. You have people and movements, and things just get moving, and then the media and what gets reflected back or not reflected back. That's a very interesting triangle. Now, Brenton, I'm going to invite you to comment on just about anything you've heard thus far, but if I could just throw one thought at you. The states of change and Nesta experience you've had over some years now is this issue about building skills and capability, that this stuff happens to some extent as a function of actually shifting the skill base. That's an invitation to talk a little bit about what you've learned from that process, perhaps over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Well, maybe I can start there and I'll finish. Actually, I want to come back to the media point that you you neatly set up, because actually I think I haven't heard that yet. And I think there's a really interesting lesson there against what we may not want to snap back around. But look, we've been advocating, building an experimental mindset in government, trying to build that agility, humility, curiosity, all of these sorts of things that you tend to bring into any situation where you want to try something new and test it. And in a way, the pandemic has kind of created a necessity for this to happen. So actually, going back to the initial question, is innovation expected rather than questioned? I'm not sure it's expected, but in a way, it's kind of unavoidable, right? And so therefore, it's actually probably tolerated to a greater degree. There is no alternative, in a sense, other than to try stuff out. It's kind of back to the sort of the FDR quote about experimentation in the face of not knowing what the right way forward is. And maybe I might use that as a link to the media question. So when I started in the Prime Minister's department 20 odd years ago, one of the sort of early tests every morning was to come in and read the sort of the tabloids from cover to cover and do the sort of the Daily Telegraph kind of smell test to see what we were going to spend the whole day, responding to and being very reactive about. What's been really interesting, if I think about the Australian experience over the last few months, Melbourne's just come out of one of the longest lockdowns of any city in the world. As particularly as the lockdown dragged on, in the face of quite concerted media hostility to the decisions of the state government, and yet the levels of public support for the policy decisions that have been taken were incredibly robust. 3-4 months into the lockdown, public support for the actual lockdown sort of approach was still over 60%. And it started off in the sort of high 70s, 80%. And after 4 months of people having to endure some fairly sort of harsh privations, they were still over 60%. And so I think there's a really interesting observation here about the willingness to have some greater policy ambition and not to be browbeaten into whether or not it will or won't pass the smell test in our sort of more sort of, rabid media outlets who just want to make merry with the fact that actually this thing may not work. I think the best leaders, both in terms of public sector leaders as well as political leaders, have actually taken the public into their confidence. They've admitted openly that we don't know the perfect solution, but we're going to try something, and they've course corrected, and they've taken the people through that journey. They've been very candid and transparent about data and their thought processes and the various protocols or sort of decision architecture that they're sort of following. So I think, you know, if there's something that we can take away from this sort of experience, is that maybe we might challenge these paper tigers a little bit more when we think about sort of new policies.
So, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it'll be the day, won't it, when the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph in Australia leads with a headline that says, you know, government made 3 big mistakes last week. Hooray! You know, terrific. And they were brilliant. And we've learned, you know, it's going to be a while, I suspect. But anyway, I completely get your point. Let me push you a stage further. It seems to me you're all picking up different dimensions of the same challenge, which is that big systems and big institutions shift when the incentives that drive their behavior change. Can come from outside, can come from inside, can come from a leader, or indeed it can come from an emergency. And I want to put a proposition that I'm going to make fairly not negative, but fairly tough, and that is that actually the deep incentive structure in politics and government has not changed. What's changed is that we've had a period of fear and a period of anxiety, and we're all working bloody hard to get through it. But the minute that's got, you know, the minute this vaccine turns up and we're all sort of, you know, back to normal, will those incentives that we're talking about, that will drive the kinds of changes, the new behavior that you're talking about, will we find that they were actually a little bit flimsy, and that actually deep down in the substructure, things haven't changed as much? I'm going to open that up for anyone who would care to pick that up, because it does worry me slightly that what we've seen is an astonishing display of, you know, working incredibly hard, whether it's the chief public health officers or prime ministers and premiers and Andrew Cuomo in New York and so on. And we're all sitting back admiring it. You know, in Australia, we've had the most astonishing spike in measures of trust in government. But my kind of slight worry is, yeah, we've seen a lot of hard work for 12 months, but actually nothing deep has actually shifted in terms of the incentives that will change the calculation that politicians and senior bureaucrats actually make. So I'm putting that as a proposition I hope to be either argued with or argued against. I'm very happy to hear. Matthew.
Martin, I'll come in for, I mean, look, I would only say, I'll remind you what I said at the beginning, which is, it seems to me that the way national governments, a lot of national governments worked was already highly problematic. And we already had the vacuum created by the failure of new public management. So it seems to me that there isn't really a stable status quo to which we could return. And that's why I think there will be change. The nature of that change, as I say, depends upon political coalitions and organization. So, you know, I'm going to respond also. There's a question in terms of political correctness. I'm not, you know, I mean, this is a very complex issue here, and it's not really a subject for today. But I suppose what I want to argue is that all forms of activism, on the one hand, they have two natures. All activism. This isn't just around Black Lives Matter. It's Extinction Rebellion. It's all forms of activism. On the one hand, they're incredibly powerful ways of challenging society, challenging the status quo, raising awareness. They drive progress. On the other hand, all movements have a danger of becoming inward-looking and getting too detached from where the public is starting from, which makes them vulnerable to be caricatured by the media, by the establishment. And that dual nature of activism is just the nature of the thing. And one has to be aware of it and work with it, it seems to me. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a quick comment actually just come in on the chat that says, kind of along the lines that says, yeah, the problem with that kind of exactly the point you're making is that can very quickly get either sidelined or marginalized by people saying, oh, it's just political correctness or whatever. You know, it just gets shunted off.
I'm not falling into that caricature. I'm just simply saying the nature of activism is this, you know, that's what it's like, you know, and I've spent my whole life being active in various ways and know the way that groups can become inward looking and can become detached, and then they very easily get isolated and lose the momentum. And I don't want that to happen to the equality movement, just like I don't want it to happen to Extinction Rebellion.
No. Precisely. No, got it. Let me invite the others to talk around this sort of broadly, this incentive issue. And perhaps Giulio, I'll go back to your, you know, will the incentive not to have 5 letters before you have a meeting with your next door ministry, is that incentive really and truly gone? Or has it just been suspended while hostilities, as it were, are raging? And the minute it's all over, we'll go back to writing 5 letters before we have a meeting.
Yeah, I think this is really, part of it is how you think a system changed, right? And whether what we've seen is basically fundamentally some nice surface change, but actually the deep incentive structures have remained the same. And I think what will be part of a legacy of this is looking for places where some really radical experiments happen. So, I remember from a State of Change festival, the Victoria State, right, that split into two and organized itself around missions, the government. Areas are something there that is going to remain permanently and really change deeply how some of these things are organized or not. In Indonesia, the West Java, which has a population size of South Korea, locked down because a number of activists did the modeling for the governor. And they went to the governor and said, if you don't lock down, you're going to have an incredible number of cases. And that's the only actually province, I think, that at the beginning locked down. Is that going to stay? Did it fundamentally change the relationship between citizens and government when we move forward? I think that's going to be the really interesting thing, looking at these more perhaps extreme cases where some of the fundamentals seems to have been challenged and see whether any of that is going to stay. For the rest, I think, it boils down to, I think it was Lyndon Johnson, right? When Martin Luther King went to him with a plan and he said, well, this is all perfectly right, but you have to make me do it. I think we are back to the same, I'm afraid, in many ways, move forward. And it goes back to the activism, I said, that Matthew was talking about.
Funnily enough, I want to raise Lyndon Johnson in just a minute because an interesting question has just come in the chat. There we are. That's a teaser for you. What about Brenton, Nadine? Anything you'd like to add a little bit around this? Because I want to pivot to two quite separate topics in a minute. This issue about incentives, are they genuinely shifting so that we can be reasonably confident that this pandemic will have left behind a new incentive structure more in line with the kind of vision that you guys have been so persuasively outlining in the last sort of, hour and 5 minutes?
I think fundamentally, it's going to be very difficult for us to. I think ultimately, I think people are desperately trying to hold on to the old incentive structures. But I just want to and I do think that we haven't quite crossed the line yet in terms of being able to be a bit more confident. I think that there was almost a bit of, I hate to say it, but when the vaccine news came and it was kind of fanfared, it was almost as if I felt a fear that would signal, oh, that's okay then. We can just keep going and doing what we were. And I'm not saying that we don't want a vaccine. Of course we want the vaccine. But in some ways, I'm worried that announcement was almost an announcement of, it's okay, we're going to just keep going as we have been before. There were kind of underlying messages in that announcement that I sort of sent a shudder through me. So I felt we're not quite, I can't be so confident yet. But I just think that whichever party or political view that you have, there are some undeniable truths that I hope do, change our incentive structures, because we've learned, haven't we, that we are living in times of complexity. There is no simple answer anymore to some of the things that just haven't gone away under new models of public management. So there are problems that have just grown and are intricate and are complex, and we have not made enough progress on. I think we've got to face the fact that some of the ways we've been doing things have been too simplified. And I think if people try and to use old methods for new problems that are getting more complex, they will quickly fail. So I think that's an undeniable thing. I think the other thing is that the issue around poverty and oppressed groups is interesting, because before the pandemic, we were talking about poverty as an issue that affected certain groups of people in certain regions of our country in the United Kingdom. So many people have experienced poverty through this pandemic. People who were prosperous, saw themselves as middle class and doing well, have experienced incredible fear around their futures, and that has not gone away. So I think that I think that for whichever party you're in and whatever incentive structures you have, those are undeniable facts that I hope do force people to think very differently.
Brenton, do you want to chip in on this one before we switch to a couple of other topics?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the interesting things also for me in this sort of 9 months has been around orthodoxies around public finance. And and what is and isn't acceptable. And in a sense, sort of the debate in so many countries around the world is, how do we make do with this limited pot of which the public, or the sort of the political settlement has deemed this is all we can afford to spend. This year we've looked down the back of the couch and we found hundreds of billions of dollars of loose change down the back. And suddenly we have realized that there was an artificial constraint on what we can spend, not wholly, but to probably a far greater degree than we have believed to this date. And actually what's become increasingly stark is when we don't fund things, they are because we've made a strategic choice. And so when the virus has, with unerring aim, found the cracks in our system, whether that be aged care in Australia, or various other forms of preparedness in other countries, the tide's gone out and we've seen who's not wearing trousers, and we realize that actually this is a choice we've made. We've chosen not to invest in these particular areas of public policy. And I now that people understand that we can actually deficit or debt finance to a greater degree than has been the case in the past, we'll ask the question, so why are you telling me my grandmother has to die rather than there be an extra 100 billion on the national deficit, the national debt rather. So I think that is potentially quite a liberating realization, and potentially quite a challenging one to, as I say, sort of political settlements on all sides.
Good. I'm going to, there's a couple of other topics that have come up in the chat, which I'd like to grab, because it's always nice if I can to respond to the group. But let me put you all on notice about where we're going to end, just so you can start compartmentalizing this in your capacious brains. There are two questions we're going to end with. The first is, what advice do you have for the OECD itself as a major institution? It does seem to me, in all seriousness, the OECD, I mean, this whole series is an experiment by the OECD to listen, I might say, I think. So what's our parting advice before the end of this session? So just park this to the OECD as an institution. What can it be doing? What should it be doing to make sure that it doesn't snap back, if I can use the awful phrase, but actually learns? That's one thing. And the second thing I'm going to ask you is a very personal question about what this 12 months has taught you about what you're going to do or are already doing differently, individually, in your work, in your engagement with the stuff. So what's the shift at a personal level? So we'll come to that in a minute. Two other quick topics, just small ones. One of them is about talent, and the other is about narrative. The first one is a question that's come up, or a comment on the chat that says, look, there's lots of great people inside central government, local government, trying very, very hard to get a lot of this stuff done. It is not true, as Charlie Ledbeater and others remind us regularly, that all systems that we're trying to shift have got nobody inside it who say, yes, we know, we'd love to shift it too. So question to all of you, what are we learning from the pandemic experience about, if I can use the sort of glib phrase, unleashing talent, liberating talent? Are we learning anything? Or is it actually just as awful as it often is for people who genuinely want to shift systems but get stuck inside them and don't get the leadership? So that's one, liberating talent. And the second comment, I'm going to put them both.
Let's do that. Yeah, sure.
All right, let me come back to the other one.
You've given us 3 questions and we've got 15 minutes left. Well, look, what I'd say on that slightly tangentially, but I think it is important, is that I've been doing quite a lot of work on, leadership and what this crisis has meant for leadership. We haven't really got into that very much, and I think this crisis has, is having a major impact on leaders. Partly the crisis itself and the specifics of it, the response to it. Partly also Black Lives Matter has had an important impact. I think it's really got through, it certainly has for me, to leaders to question themselves much more deeply than they had before. But one dimension of that, so when I talk about leadership, I talk about kind of 3 kind of dichotomies in a sense. And I just end with the one that's most interesting in terms of this. So one is higher expectations in a context of profound resource constraints. That's one kind of dilemma. The second is an expectation of innovation at a time of risk aversion. That's the second really big problem, I think. But the third one is what I describe as hierarchy is dead, long live hierarchy. And what I mean by that is that hierarchy has been subverted in many ways during this crisis. Organizations have had to work in much flatter ways. They lots of systems have fallen by the wayside, and people have gone, well, why did we need those systems? Look, it looks like we can cope perfectly well without an elaborate performance management system or, whatever. So that's liberating, but yet entirely flat organizations beyond a certain size simply don't work, right? So, and somebody has to make difficult decisions at the end of the day. It's all very well pulling the hierarchy apart, but when someone's got to make a really tough decision, and a lot of people are making really tough decisions, that's what leaders have to do. So there's something really interesting here about the nature of hierarchy in a post-COVID world. And I think that issue is implicit in a lot of organizations right now. And I think that this is a way of taking your issue, Martin, about releasing talent. I think organizations have opened up. They've been willing to take insight from different directions. They've not funneled it, channeled it. But how does that work out when we have some kind of post-COVID stability? I think that's a really interesting question.
Great. Well, let's, Giulio, why don't you riff off that?
I pick up on that, just three keywords to think about in terms of talent, I think. Well, that's where I started. I think improvisation has become a really important skill, I think, that has projected people from low ranks to really important tasks that we've seen, from managing digital safety net, because we are the only one who understands digital all over ministry, right? Or things like this. So that sounds a really, really important one. And I think the really interesting question again is what happens afterwards, right? So you emerge all these talents, you realize that as soon as you start looking, actually you have this talent, except that, what do you do with it moving forward? Are you able to capitalize on it or not? The second thing, which picks very much on what Matthew was saying, I sense a much higher tone of reflectivity and reflection, both in terms of emergency, having reconnected people to the reason why they joined the civil service in the first place. Secondly, because the disease has often affected people in incredibly personal ways, either families or relatives, etc. And so that distance that often you find between planner or service delivery and the people has been somewhat reduced from a very personal level, and also brought back some sense of humility and reconnectedness. But the third thing, which I think we haven't talked about, and it's somewhat related to talent, unfortunately, is a sense of utter exhaustion, which I certainly pick up across many different levels of governments that we're talking to, and how that is going to carry forward. And does it actually put a new spin or understanding of what are conditions for well-being in the public sector? I'm not so sure.
That's a great point, and good, nice segue, I think, Brenton, maybe for some quick comments from your perspective, not just from states of change, but just more generally, and then I'll throw to Nadine again, and then we'll wrap up with one last topic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll be very brief. I just pick up on the liberating talent question. I mean, again, sort of, there's been a lot of frustration in many governments around the world that actually we're not fully utilizing the full capacities of capabilities of our workforce, and some of the sort of energy that came out through One Team Gov, which has now sort of sprung a global movement, is testament to that. I mean, one example I would point to, some on this call may be familiar with it, but if you're not, check it out, is in the Canadian government, the Free Agents program, which was something that was being tested over the last 5 years to try and liberate talent, to get them to go where the need is, or where their talents can actually add value. I'd be really curious to kind of hear from those guys how the COVID experience has transformed their, I guess, the reception that they've been getting in different departments across the Canadian federal government. But I definitely think that's a model that's worth looking at. And
Nadine, do you want to? No, good. No, thank you. Nadine, do you want to chip in on that particular issue around liberating talent?
I think that, well, we've had a lot of conversations at CPI with the workforces of the healthcare system, social care system, those working in communities and charities, and there's what they're calling for from leadership is for leaders to really start to to stop doing things and to start being something. So there's a kind of, the emphasis on leadership has always been, if you're busy doing things, then that means that you're a very successful leader, as opposed to what do you stand for? And I think that the younger generation, particularly, that are coming into the civil service and the public sector, are looking for inspirational leadership, less around the doing stuff and more about just focusing on the being of leadership. So that means connecting younger people, particularly around the values of the organization, what behaviors we want to be able to see, the relationships, you know, a bit like the New Zealand moral spirit of service, for example, which I think is very inspirational for the civil service here in the UK. So really just thinking about less about process, more about the relationships. And I think that for leaders, that's not a difficult thing, right? I mean, I think but we're not asking leaders to come up with complex, you know, formulas for the future. We're asking them to just reconnect with their workforce. And I think one way to do that is you can create very, very safe learning environments in certain parts of your organization. So there are parts of the healthcare and NHS system that are already asking if they can find an area of health, maybe kind of a vertical system in the healthcare system, and create a safe experiment where they can come together and reconnect and really hear how it's been for them, what they need now going forward, and what will bind them with their communities and their patients. And I think you can do that in safer. So I'd say to a leader, find a passionate cohort of people that work in part of your system and try and experiment with them in how to build bridges and focus on the being and not the doing. So that would be that. And I think less focus on and in recruitment, particularly government in the UK has, you know, everyone knows, dare I say, Dominic Cummings did put a call out for, you know,
yes, we noticed
the call out that for people. Yes. Now, I think that there are plenty of people that want to join government, but talking to people that haven't, it's definitely not, there isn't a feel of a real family, a real community that they would be joining, where they would be supported and welcomed. So I think that there's obviously a lot of work to do in making public service look and still feel attractive for people, and that is the job of leaders. That is the job of leaders, to be inspirational and to drive and lead that change. Anyway, I'll stop there because of time.
Yeah, no, we are a bit short of time. The only reason I was going to raise Lyndon Johnson was an answer, not really just him, but to quickly raise an issue which perhaps might be too difficult at this point, but I want to acknowledge it from the chat. Is there an issue around this where some of these ideas need to cohere into a narrative that someone quite influential, inspirational, and clear can actually help us put together? In other words, a kind of Lyndon Johnson at the time of the civil rights movement, or even a Martin Luther King, or an FDR in the middle of the Great Depression, Winston Churchill and the war, and so on. Is there an issue here about where this narrative coheres, or is it not perhaps that we're looking for anymore as a sort of a single, you know, who will lead us into this new paradigm? Matthew, I might just chuck to you for a couple of seconds on that one, because it does seem an interesting theme.
We've got 6 minutes left, and you've also asked us 2 other questions. I'm going to give you one.
That's okay. No, you'll be fine.
The other 2 you asked us. So on that question,
I won't forget.
On that question, look, you know, I come on international panels now from Britain, and I notice people looking at me with a mixture of kind of, well, it was kind of just sympathy tinged with a certain amount of contempt, you know, and I don't blame you, you know, really. But the one little bit of hope I've got is that we are hosting, Britain's hosting COP26 next year. We've got a new president. I think there is a possibility of a fundamental global shift towards a recognition of the need for a truly sustainable global economy. If that happens, that is the wrapper, it seems to me, within which an awful lot of other change is possible. So, you know, I want to end with a bit of hope. And you know, saying nice things about Boris Johnson does not come naturally to me, but he does seem, and even today he's making big announcements. Today he is bringing forward the date by which all petrol and diesel cars have to go out of commission to 2030 rather than 2040. That's a big risk. I mean, we are nowhere near having the infrastructure for that. So, you know, these are big things. So that gives me hope, and that would be the kind of narrative wrapper, it seems to me. You asked us 2 other questions. OECD. The OECD should invest less in content and more in relationships. The world is full of bloody content. There's too much content. No one can read it. You know, What we need is fewer bricks and more cement. And what the OECD should do is shifting its investment to enabling people to spend time together, get together, strengthen networks, invest in the stuff that no one else will invest in, right? That's really, really important. And what has the last 12 months taught me? It's taught me, I'm very proud of how the RSA has changed into an organization that really thinks about change and is working very differently. I've also realized that having achieved that, I'm not the right person to take it on the next bit of the journey, and that I am a bit white, male, stale, old. So it's time for me to think about how I can use my skills more effectively in the future. No, I'm not announcing my resignation, but I have kind of.
I was going to say I was just sitting back here thinking, holy hell.
People like me are a bit of the problem, and if we're serious about this equality stuff, we have to start by looking in the mirror. So that's what I've learned a bit.
I hope everyone's written that down. And debricking the OECD, that seems like not a bad line. Brenton, if you had a quick piece of gratuitous advice for this very substantial institution that we are currently hosted by, what would you offer them?
Yeah, look, I mean, I want to sort of loop back to that very strong image that Matthew raised earlier of Carrie with the hand coming out of the grave. Because something that I had sort of preconceived to sort of bring into this conversation is around sort of this notion of zombie orthodoxies and the fact that they just don't go away. The OECD, and we've talked about a couple, one around new public management, one around sort of debt financing and public finance. One of the things that the OECD does do well is through its benchmarking and through other sort of standard setting and the various sort of modalities that it does have, it can help to shift the needle on what is deemed to be kind of acceptable, good practice policy. What I would love to see is the OECD advocating the kind of the policy settlements that will enable us to move into the world that Matthew's just described, rather than keeping us shackled to orthodoxies that are well past their prime. So that would be my gratuitous advice to the OECD. Use your bully pulpit to actually give countries the steer on what is going to be next generation governance, decision-making, finance, and so on, public sector management.
Right.
What have I learned in the last 12 months? Well, funnily enough, I've just come back from a 10-day silent meditation retreat, and one of the things that I was reflecting on there was on this concept of anicca, so impermanence. Which is basically, everything is constantly in a state of change, which means that our organization is aptly named. And what that means is, in the depths of crisis, it feels like, things aren't going to get better. Or, in sort of when we're trying something, we may have temporary setbacks. And I think what I'm taking away from this year and these last 10 days on this retreat kind of really bookended for me is about sort of maintaining that equanimity, not getting sort of super elated about the vaccine news, because there's still a hell of a lot of other work that we need to do, and not getting super depressed about the sort of the body count, which is tragic, but we do need to move forward from where we are. Mm-hmm. So equanimity.
Brenton, can I just interrupt Martin? Brenton, Karen Blixen, the author, once wrote something which Raymond Carver had pinned on his desk, and it said, advice to writers, and it said, write every day without hope, without despair.
Okay, write that one down. Okay, Giulio and Nadine. I'll go with Giulio first. I'm going to finish with Nadine. Quick final reflections. OECD and anything you'd like to throw in from your own personal reflections of the last 12 months.
I'll try to answer three things, actually, but very quickly. One,
Good.
Narratives.
Good.
Look at developing countries and many places in Asia to radically rethink what actually the new narrative is. Some of what were considered best practices, traditionally countries and points of reference, have been really damaged in many different ways.
I think Matthew made that point earlier. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that is the new narrative is going to change, coming out, I think, eventually. For the OECD, just like for us, and I think I echo very much what Brenton was saying, right? Used futures, right? So things that seem to be a really good idea at a certain point in time, and now like a used car, time to get rid of it. I think there's a lot of this still hanging on. And I think some fundamental investments that I was saying at the beginning in terms of capacity and infrastructure, universal healthcare, UBI, these type of things, really now it's a moment to go for it. And I think we all in the international community need to coalesce around this. Personally, one thing is just purely about profession and things, since we talked about innovation. It was actually quite humbling to be in the middle of a crisis and say, okay, so as an innovation person, what do you do? And when we actually picked up very much on your blog and provocation, Martin, and said, actually, one of the good things that we can do is to start documenting the beginning of this innovation dividend. That has proven to be both very useful for us, but also very useful, I think, for the people that we talked to, because they were in the trenches and they really didn't have a second to breathe and think through what was happening to them. And I think actually being able to carve out a space to do that has been both liberating for both sides, and I think a really interesting thing for us to think was moving forward, because now we can go back to these insights and actually look at them with hindsight and think, reflect on them. What does it mean for all of us?
Fantastic. Nadine, final quick reflections from you, and then I've got one quote and we're going to wrap up. We will be 1 minute late, I suspect, but I'm not going to get too stressed about
then
that.
I'll make it very quick.
In the interest of equanimity, I'm just fine about that.
I agree with everything Matthew said about the in terms of what the OECD can do. I think it would be great to see them to actually be taking the lead and charge on the need for the paradigm shift that we've been talking about, and start to articulate what that could feel and look like more, and to see and some new and different voices coming into that. So that's one point. I think for me, what have we learned? What have I learned? I think there are 3 important words that I will take with me into the next era and phase of this pandemic and recovery, and those are listen, learn, and adapt. Those are 3 things that I think we all have to do, and I've learned are very, very important. And then finally, from the point of view of communities, because I do want to speak for them here, because they don't get a say enough in these conversations, I've learned that the people are not hard to reach. They are seldom heard. They can be your biggest cheerleaders. Work with them. They are your recovery and your rebuild.
Nadine, can I give you another quote? Nadine,
please.
Got one other quote. A guy called Stephen Coleman, one of my favorite quotes. He said, "The problem in public policy is hard to reach people, and there's no harder to reach people than politicians."
Yeah. Exactly.
I think I might have heard that quote from Stephen. Let me finish with this quote, if I could, and then I'm going to wrap up. It's from the Israeli philosopher Gershom Scholem. "There are in history what you would call plastic hours, namely crucial moments when it is possible to act. If you move, then something happens. In such moments, an ossified social order suddenly turns pliable. Prolonged stasis gives way to motion, and people dare to hope. Plastic hours are rare. They require the right alignment of public opinion, political power, and events, usually a crisis. They depend on social mobilization and leadership, and they can come and go unnoticed or wasted. Nothing happens unless you move." And I think the last hour and a quarter and 2 extra minutes that I'm stealing from everyone's evening or morning has given us an absolute masterclass, if I might say so, in the different dimensions of exactly that moment that we appear to be navigating. And I think I'm going to recommend to everybody who's on this call, watch the call again, because I think you'll get even more out of it than you did just over the last hour. And at least send one other person in your network the link to this particular conversation, because I think they'll get an enormous amount out of it. Thank you to the OECD. Thank you very much to everybody who's tuned in, and a very, very big thank you to a wonderful panel. I hope you all have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are, and I've no doubt we will see you again very soon. All the best. Thanks very much.